Captain Rebecca Martinez had always known that being a woman in the Army meant proving herself twice as hard as her male counterparts. At 28, she had already earned her helicopter pilot certification and served 2 tours overseas, but none of that seemed to matter to Colonel James Patterson, her commanding officer at Fort Blackwood. Patterson had made it clear from day one that he believed women had no place in combat aviation, and he never missed an opportunity to remind her of his opinion. The morning of September 15th started like any other. Rebecca was conducting routine maintenance checks on her U-60 Black Hawk when Patterson approached with his usual scowl. "Martinez, you're grounded," he announced without preamble. "I'm reassigning you to desk duty. We need someone reliable in the air today, and frankly, I don't trust you with a $40 million aircraft." Rebecca's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. "Sir, with respect, my flight record is spotless. I've completed over 300 successful missions without incident." Patterson's laugh was cold and dismissive. "Numbers don't tell the whole story, Martinez. Flying isn't just about technical skill. It's about instinct, courage, and split-second decision-making under pressure. Qualities that, in my experience, women simply don't possess in sufficient measure." The other pilots in the hangar fell silent, watching the exchange with uncomfortable expressions. Rebecca felt the familiar burn of humiliation rise in her chest, but she forced herself to remain professional. "I understand your concern, sir, but I believe my record speaks for itself. Perhaps we could discuss this privately." Patterson's eyes narrowed. "There's nothing to discuss. You're grounded, effective immediately. That's an order." He turned on his heel and strode away, leaving Rebecca standing alone among the stares of her colleagues. Later that afternoon, Rebecca sat in the administrative office, filing reports and trying to ignore the sympathetic glances from the other personnel. Through the window, she could see the flight line where her Black Hawk sat idle while her male counterparts prepared for their missions. The injustice of it all gnawed at her. She had worked twice as hard as anyone else to get where she was, and Patterson's obvious bias was destroying everything she had built. Her friend and fellow pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Johnson, stopped by her desk around 3 o'clock. "This is complete garbage, Becca," he said in a low voice. "Everyone knows you're one of the best pilots on the base. Patterson's just being a sexist jerk." Rebecca appreciated the support, but it didn't change her situation. "Thanks, Marcus, but there's not much I can do about it. He's the and he's made his decision." Marcus shook his head. "There has to be something. Have you considered filing a complaint with the Inspector General?" Rebecca had thought about it, but she knew how these things went. It would be her word against a decorated colonel's, and the process could take months or even years. The weather forecast for the next day called for severe thunderstorms, and Rebecca found herself hoping that Patterson would reconsider his decision. Storm flying was dangerous, and every available pilot should be ready. But as evening approached, It became clear that Patterson had no intention of changing his mind. Rebecca went to bed that night feeling defeated and wondering if her military career was effectively over. The next morning brought news that would change everything. A priority mission had come down from division headquarters, a downed aircraft in hostile territory that needed immediate extraction. The pilot was severely injured, and time was running out. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes operation that separated the good pilots from the great ones. Rebecca watched from the administrative building as the flight crews prepared for departure, her heart aching with the knowledge that she should be out there with them. Colonel Patterson personally briefed the mission, emphasizing the dangers and the importance of success. "This is going to be rough, gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the briefing room. "The weather is deteriorating, and we've got enemy forces in the area. I need my best people on this one." Rebecca noticed that he didn't even glance in her direction, as if she didn't exist. The slight stung, but she pushed the feeling aside and focused on the mission details, hoping that somehow she might still be able to contribute. The first helicopter took off at 800 hours, disappearing into the gray morning sky. Rebecca remained at her desk, trying to concentrate on paperwork while her mind wandered to the men flying into danger. She knew every one of them personally, had trained with them, flown with them. The thought of them facing such risks while she sat safely behind a desk made her feel sick with guilt and frustration. 2 hours later, the radio crackled with urgent communications. The mission had gone wrong. The rescue helicopter had been hit by enemy fire and had crashed in a remote mountainous area. The crew was alive but trapped, and their position was becoming increasingly precarious as enemy forces closed in. Worse still, the weather was deteriorating rapidly, making any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. Colonel Patterson's face was grim as he assessed the situation. "We need to get another bird in there now," he said, his voice tight with tension. "But the weather's getting worse and we're running out of pilots." Rebecca felt a surge of hope. Surely now he would have to put her back on flight status. She approached his desk with measured steps. "Sir, I volunteer for the rescue mission. I know that terrain, and I have experience in adverse weather conditions." Patterson didn't even look up from his maps. "Absolutely not, Martinez. This is not the time for experiments. We need experienced pilots, not someone trying to prove a point." The dismissal was so casual, so absolute, that Rebecca felt something break inside her. She had given everything to the army, had sacrificed relationships, comfort, and safety in service to her country. And now, when her fellow soldiers needed her most, she was being sidelined because of one man's prejudice. The injustice of it was overwhelming, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Sir, with respect, I am an experienced pilot. My record—" Patterson's hand slammed down on the desk. "Your record is irrelevant, Martinez. This is a combat situation, and I will not risk the lives of good soldiers on your feminist crusade." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Rebecca felt the eyes of everyone in the room on her, some sympathetic, others embarrassed by the display. She took a deep breath, fighting back tears of rage and frustration. "I understand, sir," she said quietly, then turned and walked back to her desk with as much dignity as she could muster. For the next hour, Rebecca watched as Patterson and his staff struggled to find a solution. The weather was worsening by the minute, and the enemy forces were closing in on the crash site. Every pilot on the base was either already in the air, injured, or deemed unsuitable for the mission. The clock was ticking, and with each passing moment, the chances of a successful rescue diminished. Finally, around noon, Patterson made a decision that sent shockwaves through the base. "We're going to have to scrub the mission," he announced. "The weather's too bad and we don't have the personnel. We'll have to wait for the storm to pass." Rebecca couldn't believe what she was hearing. 4 good soldiers were trapped in enemy territory, and Patterson was giving up because he refused to use his most available resource, her. Lieutenant Johnson approached her desk again, his face flushed with anger. "This is insane, Becca. Those guys are going to die because of Patterson's ego." Rebecca nodded, her own anger building. "I know Marcus, but there's nothing I can do. He's made his decision." But even as she said the words, she was formulating a plan. She couldn't stand by and watch good soldiers die because of one man's prejudice. That evening, as the storm raged outside, Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. She had tried to work within the system, had played by the rules, had been the model soldier. But the system had failed her, and more importantly, it had failed the men trapped in that helicopter. Sometimes, doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. Sometimes, it meant risking everything. She waited until the base was quiet, until the night shift had settled into their routine. Then she slipped out of her quarters and made her way to the flight line. The rain was coming down in sheets and the wind was howling across the tarmac. Perfect conditions for what she had in mind. She approached her Black Hawk, running her hands along its familiar surfaces. This aircraft had been her partner for 3 years, and she knew every rivet, every system, every quirk. The pre-flight check was routine, muscle memory taking over even in the difficult conditions. Rebecca had done this hundreds of times, but never under circumstances like these. She was about to commit the ultimate act of military insubordination, taking an aircraft without authorization to conduct an unauthorized rescue mission. The penalties could be severe, including court-martial and imprisonment. But as she thought about her fellow soldiers trapped in that wreck, she knew she had no choice. The engines spooled up with their familiar whine, and Rebecca felt a surge of adrenaline. This was where she belonged, not behind a desk filing reports. She ran through her final checks, then keyed the radio. "Tower, this is Black Hawk 77 requesting immediate departure for search and rescue mission." The response was immediate and sharp. "Black Hawk 77, you are not authorized for departure. Return to parking immediately." Rebecca switched off the radio and lifted off into the storm. The flight to the crash site was harrowing. The weather was worse than she had anticipated, with winds gusting up to 60 miles per hour and visibility near zero. Rain lashed the windscreen, and lightning illuminated the mountainous terrain in stark, terrifying detail. Rebecca had flown in bad weather before, but this was pushing the limits of what was possible. She pressed on, following her GPS coordinates and trusting her instruments. 20 minutes into the flight, she spotted the wreckage. The rescue helicopter had gone down in a narrow valley, its twisted remains scattered across the rocky terrain. Rebecca could see figures moving near the crash site, survivors, but also enemy forces closing in. She had to act fast. The landing zone was barely large enough for her aircraft, with steep rocky walls on all sides. It was the kind of approach that would challenge even the most experienced pilot in perfect conditions. Rebecca began her descent, fighting the crosswinds and trying to maintain control. The Black Hawk bucked and rolled as she brought it down, the rotor wash creating a whirlwind of debris. She could see the survivors now, 3 men, one of them clearly injured. They were waving frantically, obviously surprised to see a rescue aircraft in these conditions. Rebecca managed to get the aircraft down, the skids barely fitting on the narrow ledge where the wreckage lay. The survivors moved quickly, helping their injured comrade toward the helicopter. Rebecca could see enemy muzzle flashes in the distance. They were running out of time. She kept the rotors turning, ready for immediate departure. The men loaded their wounded friend into the cabin, then climbed aboard themselves. "Go, go, go!" One of them shouted over the noise of the engines. Rebecca didn't need to be told twice. The takeoff was even more challenging than the landing. With the additional weight and the deteriorating weather, the Black Hawk was operating at the very edge of its performance envelope. Rebecca pulled every trick she knew, using the terrain and the wind to her advantage. Slowly, agonizingly, the aircraft climbed out of the valley and into the relative safety of the higher altitudes. The flight back to base was a blur of concentration and determination. Rebecca battled the storm every mile of the way, her hands cramping from gripping the controls so tightly. Behind her, the survivors were tending to their wounded friend, and she could hear them talking in amazed voices about the rescue. "I can't believe someone came for us in this weather," one of them said. "That was the most incredible flying I've ever seen." As they approached Fort Blackwood, Rebecca knew that her troubles were just beginning. She had disobeyed direct orders, stolen government property, and put herself and others at risk. Colonel Patterson would be furious, and there would be consequences. But she had also saved 4 lives, and that was something no one could take away from her. She brought the Black Hawk down on the main helipad, where emergency medical personnel were already waiting. The injured soldier was quickly loaded onto a stretcher and rushed to the medical facility. The other survivors were debriefed by intelligence officers, eager to learn what had happened at the crash site. Rebecca shut down the aircraft and stepped out into the rain, her flight suit soaked and her hair plastered to her head. Colonel Patterson was waiting for her, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. "Martinez, you are under arrest for theft of government property, disobeying direct orders and reckless endangerment," he said, his voice cold and formal. "You will be confined to quarters pending court-martial proceedings." Rebecca nodded, accepting the inevitable. She had known this would happen, had accepted the consequences before she ever started the engines. But as she was led away, she heard something that made her heart soar. The survivors were telling their story to anyone who would listen, describing the incredible skill and courage of the pilot who had risked everything to save them. Word spread quickly through the base, and by evening, everyone knew what had happened. Rebecca Martinez, the pilot who had been grounded for being a woman, had pulled off the most daring rescue in the base's history. The court-martial proceedings began a week later. Colonel Patterson pressed for the maximum penalties, painting Rebecca as a reckless insubordinate who had endangered lives and damaged military discipline. But the defense painted a different picture, that of a dedicated officer who had been forced to act when the system failed. The survivors testified on her behalf, describing her skill and courage in the most glowing terms. The media picked up the story, and suddenly Rebecca found herself at the center of a national debate about women in combat and military leadership. Feminist groups hailed her as a hero, while military traditionalists criticized her for breaking the chain of command. Letters of support poured in from around the country, many from other female service members who had faced similar discrimination. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and throughout it all, Rebecca maintained her dignity and her conviction that she had done the right thing. When the verdict was finally announced, she was found guilty of the technical violations but received only a reprimand and a brief suspension. The military court recognized that her actions, while technically wrong, had been motivated by the highest ideals of military service. But the real vindication came 6 months later, when Colonel Patterson was quietly reassigned to a desk job at the Pentagon. An investigation into his leadership had revealed a pattern of discrimination and bias that could no longer be ignored. Rebecca was not only restored to full flight status, but was also promoted to major and given command of her own squadron. On her first day as squadron commander, Major Rebecca Martinez stood before her pilots, men and women alike, and spoke about the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. She had learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from following orders blindly, but from having the courage to do what is right, even when it costs you everything. The helicopter she had flown that stormy night was eventually retired and put on display at the base museum. A plaque beneath it read, "In honor of those who risk everything to save others." Rebecca would often stop by to look at it, remembering the night when she had chosen courage over compliance and how that choice had changed everything. Years later, when young female pilots would ask her for advice, she would always tell them the same thing. Never let anyone tell you that you don't belong somewhere just because of who you are. Sometimes you have to prove them wrong by walking through the fire and coming out the other side. And they would nod, understanding that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not against external enemies, but against the prejudices and limitations that others try to impose on us. Rebecca's story became legend in military circles, a reminder that true leadership isn't about following orders blindly, but about having the courage to do what is right, even when it means walking through smoke and fire to prove that you belong exactly where you are. She had been told that the helicopter was unrecoverable, that the mission was impossible, that she didn't have what it took. But she had walked out of that storm covered in smoke and rain, carrying 4 lives with her, and proving that sometimes the person everyone doubts is exactly the person you need when everything is on the line. The lessons of that night would stay with her for the rest of her career. She would go on to train hundreds of pilots, both male and female, always emphasizing that skill and courage know no gender. And whenever someone would suggest that women weren't suited for combat aviation, she would simply point to the display case in the museum and say, "Tell that to the 4 men who are alive today, because one woman refused to accept that she wasn't good enough." In the end, Rebecca Martinez had done more than just rescue 4 soldiers from a crashed helicopter. She had rescued the principle that merit should matter more than prejudice, that courage should be recognized regardless of its source, and that sometimes the greatest act of service is refusing to accept the limitations that others try to place on you. She had walked through the fire and emerged not just unburned, but stronger than ever before.